So, as endurance athletes, we do a lot of physical work when we're training or racing, and our metabolic rate goes way up. So basically, we're burning a lot of calories. If you're a runner or a cyclist and you go out for a training run or a ride, you go from burning maybe like 60 to 100 calories per hour, just kind of putzing around in your normal everyday life, and then you go to like 500 or 1,000 calories per hour or more sometimes when you're out training or racing. And so in order to do that, we have to take in a lot of oxygen from the air and deliver it to our muscles, and then use that oxygen to oxidize fuel, or burn it, in other words. And as we oxidize fats and carbohydrates, we're able to generate ATP, which is kind of the chemical energy store that we have in our cells that allow us to fire our muscles repeatedly and do work, whether we're running or cycling or whatever it is that we're doing. So this is pretty obvious, I think, for people that kind of know like the basics of how our bodies work. But in this video, I wanted to talk briefly about our cardiovascular system and our blood, and what training and racing means for those systems in a very simple kind of broad overview sort of way. So basically, if I'm just sitting here and I'm not really doing a whole lot, my metabolic rate is relatively low, and I'm probably burning, let's say, like 80 calories an hour, just kind of sitting here and talking and breathing and doing normal stuff. But if I go out and I ride, I'm pretty fit, and if you look at my ride profile on Strava or something like that, you can see that I do a lot of work because I'm a moderately sized person and can do a lot of power. So I might be doing 800, 900, or 1,000 calories per hour just on average. And then when I'm doing like hard interval work, or I go hard up Mount Diablo, in the case of Diablo, I might burn 1,000 calories in 45 minutes going, pretty full gas up the mountain. So, that's a huge increase in metabolic rate and a huge increase in a demand for oxygen that your heart and lungs have to process and then deliver to your muscles. So basically, like in a broad overview sort of way, when we're exercising hard, our muscles are burning a lot of fuel, and that creates a lot of demand for oxygen. We breathe in a lot of air. Our lungs allow oxygen molecules to diffuse over the alveolar membranes, which are just little sacs of air in your lungs, and then that oxygen is picked up by the hemoglobin molecules in your red blood cells and carried around throughout your body, and that's dumped at the myoglobin molecules in your muscles, which then pick up the oxygen and allow you to burn fuel at the muscle sites where you're actually doing the physical work. And of course, oxygen gets distributed throughout your body so that your liver and your brain and other organs can function normally. But the blood flow to a lot of your organs might go down a little bit when you're exercising really hard, because maybe peak liver function isn't a high priority if you're exerting yourself very hard, but your brain is always getting a pretty steady flow of oxygen. So anyway, you transmit oxygen through that kind of basic system. But as your metabolic rate goes up and as the demand for oxygen goes up, if you're looking at total cardiac output and the amount of blood getting distributed to your body over a given period of time, going from rest to peak performance or peak exertion, that could be a 10 to 20-fold increase in cardiac output. So obviously, less fit athletes that can do less work, because maybe let's say it's a runner and they run 6 or 7 miles per hour in training, versus a world-class athlete which might be doing twice that. Their total cardiac output is going to be different. But for anyone that's just moderately fit, it'll probably go up 10 or 12-fold. For an elite athlete, it'll go up 18 or 20-fold when they're comparing resting state versus peak performance state. So that's a huge increase in cardiac output. It's a huge increase in demand for your diaphragm to inhale huge volumes of air. And at the first step of that process, your diaphragm is the only muscle that is actively engaged in inhaling when you're breathing. The rest of your core can work to kind of push air out of your lungs, but to inhale, you need your diaphragm to suck, push out your belly and expand your lung cavity. So it's interesting. There's some good research that would suggest that training your diaphragm to be stronger is an effective way to improve performance, because it reduces the demand, the effort involved in breathing when you're going pretty hard. and it improves performance for people that are asthmatics. It improves performance for people training and racing at elevation. And, there's certain breathing devices out there that you can use, which is basically breathing through a resistance device. So it's like hard to breathe in. And, I would suggest looking into that. There's good research to support that that's an effective way to improve performance, and it just takes a few minutes a day. But it's definitely something that's like way off the radar for most people. And it's something that I've done and have recommended to some of my clients. And, I would definitely recommend considering that if you're willing to spend, 5 minutes a day, outside of your normal training activities to try to improve performance. Once you get the oxygen into your lungs, it has to be carried through your blood with a lot of red blood cells and picked up in your muscles by myoglobin. All of that requires iron. And, a lot of people don't necessarily have a good handle on how much iron they're taking in. And it's really hard to quantify like how much of the iron that you take in is actually being absorbed and used by your body. In part because a lot of the sources of iron that we have in our diet that are plant-based might have a lot of iron, but there's also compounds in them that inhibit iron absorption. And, animal proteins, like if you eat meat or anything like that, will have maybe a little more iron, and it's highly available, but it's still not that much in the grand scheme of things unless you eat a lot of meat or liver, which is a great source of iron as well. But probably like the best and most effective way to tell how much iron you're getting and your body is using and making sure that you have enough but not too much is to do regular blood work, maybe every like quarter or half year at least. Given the fact that endurance sports are very demanding for our aerobic systems and require a lot of iron to transport oxygen to do all that work, it's kind of been shown pretty clearly by a lot of research that for many athletes, not all of them, but for many endurance athletes, it's helpful to supplement with some amount of iron in your diet beyond what you normally get just from your normal like natural foods. And so I personally would suggest, going and getting some basic blood work done, talking to your doctor, and considering taking in some supplemental iron. Generally, I'm not in favor of getting nutrition outside of just having a good solid diet, but that's one of the few things that seems to be pretty clearly represented in the research as being helpful for most athletes, and it's pretty easy to monitor whether or not you have a good degree of hemoglobin and red blood cells in your blood, or if you're kind of low, and you can tell how much ferritin is in your blood and whether or not you have enough iron available in your system to produce the red blood cells that you want in order to perform well. Personally, I know from past experience, whenever I've done blood work and wasn't supplementing with iron, usually my hematocrit would be much lower. It would be like in the mid to upper 30s. And later in my 20s, I started learning and reading a little bit more about iron supplementation for endurance athletes and like impaired iron absorption when you're training really hard, and decided to start adding iron to my daily routine, or rather I would take it about every other day. And I found that my hematocrit would go up to like the low 40s, like 43 give or take, and that's much more in the normal range, and definitely seemed to be associated with a non-trivial increase in performance for me. And so again, talk to your doctor, be safe, and always try to get high quality supplements that are maybe tested and rated to be clean supplements. But in general, iron is probably something that's pretty safe to take. Likewise, if you're a vegetarian or mostly vegetarian, you probably don't get enough vitamin B12. B12 is a B vitamin that you can only find in animal food sources, and it is not found in any significant quantity anywhere outside of animal food products. So if you have like liver or meat or whatever, you have small amounts of B12 in all those foods. If you eat a lot of plants, you are getting none. So any good vegetarian or vegan will know that you have to supplement with a B complex or at least a B12 supplement in order to just like function as a human being, because you will not be getting any if you don't have animal products. And even if you do eat some or regular amounts of meats, I would still consider taking a B complex, because all the B vitamins are, pretty integral to normal metabolism, but especially B12, it's integral to red blood cell production, and you really need it in order to have your blood doing what it needs to be doing, and to have, the red blood cells available to carry all the oxygen that you're trying to carry when you're doing all your training and racing sessions. Also, when you're training or racing and it's not very cold out, you're doing a lot of work, And most of that metabolism that happens when you're burning fuel, about a quarter of it, or slightly less than a quarter, actually gets used to do physical work, but a little bit more than 3/4 of the calories that you're burning are going to be wasted as heat. Well, I don't know, it's not waste, it's just like the way things are. You have an exothermic reaction that allows you to do some physical work, but most of it is lost as heat. So your body temperature would skyrocket, and you would literally fry your brain if you didn't have a really effective thermoregulatory system. So basically, as you exercise, your body sweats in proportion to how much heat it's trying to dump in the world, so that your core temperature and your brain temperature can remain a pretty constant, comfortable level. And so, as you exercise at more intense levels, your heart has to pump more and more blood to your muscles, and it also has to pump more and more blood to your skin so that you can dump fluid from your blood out into the environment and lose heat through evaporative cooling. And if it's humid, you don't get nearly as much evaporative cooling, and so you tend to sweat a lot more. And it can be helpful in some cases to pour cold water over yourself in order to help with thermoregulation, and that can be very helpful in improving performance as well. Or in the case of an event like a time trial or a cross-country race that's not terribly long, and you are trying to do a pretty peak effort, sometimes it can be very helpful to drink a moderate quantity of ice-cold fluid immediately beforehand, so it'll drop your core temperature, and you have kind of a reserve bank of extra heat that you can generate for the first part of that effort. But in any case, you're sweating a lot, you're losing a lot of fluid, and that increases your demand for hydration, which is, fluid intake, but also electrolyte intake, because as you're sweating, you're losing a lot of salt. You're losing trace amounts of other minerals, but mostly you're losing sodium. And in order to absorb and retain water as you're trying to replenish the fluid losses that you're experiencing, you need to take in a good bit of water and some sodium with it. So most drink mixes have a good bit of sodium in them, but it's highly variable how much is in there. So you should probably check to see what drink mixes you're using and how much sodium is in there. And most of them don't have as much as you would need to fully replenish the amount of sodium that you're losing. So even after your training sessions, keep in mind that if it was hot and it was a long training session and you sweat a lot, especially if you're really salty all over, it is good to add some sodium or salt to some of your meals after that training session, so that you can replenish the fluid loss and the electrolyte loss that you experienced during that last training session. And that's really integral for keeping your blood volume up, but it's also integral for proper nerve function, because sodium is helpful in water metabolism, and it's also integral to nerve function. So if you're doing very long sessions in the heat, you definitely don't want to be just eating or just drinking a lot of water and eating foods that maybe are low in sodium, because over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 hours in the heat, if you're consuming a bottle an hour or more and it isn't rich in sodium, you will be drastically reducing your body's circulating electrolyte levels, which often for cyclists, I don't think I've heard of it being a major issue for people, but pretty much every year in summertime, hot weather marathons, some of the slower runners that might take 4 or 5 hours to complete the marathon, there's usually some people that might have some health issues, and I think even very rarely there are deaths that occur when people just drink a lot of water and their nervous system can't function properly because there isn't enough sodium in their system to adequately or properly conduct nerve signals, and your cardiovascular system starts to malfunction because your heart can't fire properly when there isn't enough sodium to do it right. So definitely drink to thirst. You don't need to over consume fluids, and no matter how much sodium you consume while you're training, you're still going to have a net loss over the course of any warm training session. So take in some extra afterwards as well, but be sure that you're drinking enough, and don't go crazy and drink too much, because either of those two extremes of not drinking at all or just drinking as much as you possibly can are not helpful. So usually you can kind of go by feel to a certain extent, or if you know that you don't have a habit of appreciating drinking and you go through a bottle over the course of a 4-hour ride, keep in mind that a good benchmark for most riders or most athletes is that you could have a bottle per hour when it's in warm or hot weather. If it's hot, you might go 1.5 bottles or more if you can tolerate that in your stomach. Okay, so one, last thing, basically as we're training or racing and our blood flow goes way up and our heart is working really hard, there's a couple things that happen. One, at very high heart rate levels, our heart becomes much more powerful and it's trained to be basically a stronger pump. If you're doing extended efforts that are like tempo or threshold type, runs or cycling workouts, and you have elevated heart rate that's not quite peak, but for extended periods of time, your heart will become much more efficient at delivering blood and it becomes a more efficient pump. Both of those things are great and help drive performance down the line. Along with that though, your circulatory system has to kind of modulate how closed or open different blood vessels are to help modulate how much blood is going to your muscles versus your internal organs versus your skin versus muscles that aren't actively engaged in running or cycling, for example, because obviously you're using other muscles, but like your arms aren't doing a ton of work, but your legs are doing the bulk of the work. So your body modulates blood flow throughout your body while you're training. And one of the things that helps with that are nitrates, which are just, compounds that you find in basically all vegetables, or not all vegetables, but like most vegetables have moderate amounts of nitrates. Some of them have a lot. And beets specifically have gotten a lot of press over that in the last decade, where, supplementing with beets or beet juice can improve performance because it makes your blood vessels more dilated and allows for better better blood flow and better oxygen delivery as a result, and basically reduces the resistance that your heart is fighting against when it's pumping, because obviously like there's some fluid dynamics where it just takes some effort to deliver blood through all of your blood vessels because you have miles of them throughout your body. So if you can open them up just a little bit more with nitrate supplementation or just a diet that's very rich in vegetables generally, then it makes it easier on your heart to do the work that you're trying to do. So, that's basically just bottom line. It's a plug to eat lots of fruits and vegetables in your diet generally. And I would strongly recommend that anyone that wants to be healthy, especially an athlete, have the bulk of their, total food volume coming from unprocessed plant foods and, mostly like colorful plant foods and not just like starchy, colorless things like white potatoes or rice. Although those can be like a very integral part of getting enough carbohydrate calories to do high intensity work. But in general, you can never eat too much fruits and vegetables, especially vegetables. And if you're eating a very diverse diet that has a lot of vegetables, you don't necessarily need to go out of your way to specifically supplement with beets or beet juice in order to get a very high dose of nitrates to, perform well in training or racing. But some people like doing that. I think there's some question as to whether or not that's a good long-term strategy, and some people advocate against having high quantities of supplemental nitrates by like eating a ton of beets like every day, for example. And there's other issues with that. But in general, if you have a diet that's rich in plants and you eat lots of vegetables, you should be helping your body to perform better by giving it the nutrition that it needs, but also giving it a lot of nitrates so that your body has a much better ability to dilate your blood vessels and allow for easy delivery of blood to all of your working muscles when you're training and racing. And I think that's it for this video. Hopefully some of that's like a little bit interesting to you. I just want to give some like basic fundamental knowledge about some of the stuff that goes on in our bodies when we're training so that hopefully you have a better handle on what's happening. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.